Let's just begin with prayer. Lord, again, we're so thankful for your word and the encouragement it is to us as we study it. And as we think about the situations in which you spoke, remind us that you spoke your word to real people in real time. You made it meaningful to them, and you ask us to then make it meaningful to our people. And we're thankful for that. Thankful for books that help us to understand it in the cultural context. Be with us this evening, and we'll praise you for it in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, one of the things I do almost every day is in our Reading paper, which I pay a small fortune for, and it's usually, sometimes it's actually 6 pages long. The one section I enjoy is what happened on this date in history. So I have a question for you. What happened on this day in history 2,109 years ago? I'll tell you later.
Bill.
Yeah, you got it there, eh? Anyway, we're picking up the journeys of Paul, and Luke takes us now to the next step in that journey, and it's recorded for us in Acts 17, verses 15 and 16. And Artie, you have those verses.
Those who escorted Paul from Thessalonica brought him to Athens, and then left with instructions for Silas and Timothy to join him as soon as possible. While Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols.
For Paul, Athens was a safe city. He's not going to be beaten there as he was in many of the other cities. And it turned out to be the next city that Paul ministers in. Probably went there by ship about 300 miles, safe enough so that the Thessalonican enemies aren't going to chase him down as they had in Berea. Athens, probably the most significant city, one of the most significant cities in the ancient world. Its origin dates back somewhere between 8 and 10 centuries before Jesus, but it really came to prominence about 500 years before the birth of our Savior. By the time Paul arrived there, the city had basically faded in significance, but it was still known in the ancient world for its intellectual universities and teaching places and so forth, and as one of the cultural centers of the world. Like many cities in early Greece, Athens claimed it was a city-state. That is, it had the right to elect its own officials and government leaders. And many writers refer to Athens as the first truly democratic city unit. Nearby, Sparta was just the opposite. It was run by a political mob, political leaders, but Athens had its own leaders. A lady by the name of Rosemary Rees, who wrote somewhere around 25 history books from all over the world, a fascinating background and writer, wrote a book on the ancient Greeks. And she details in that book how democracy actually worked in Athens. Every citizen of Athens was an official member of the assembly that ruled the city. And they met as an assembly once a week. And during that time, any citizen could say anything they wanted to. Then to add to it, Athens had a council of 500 that were chosen annually by the casting of lots. And they oversaw the operation of the city and determined what topics would be brought up at the weekly meetings and so forth. I can't even begin to imagine trying to have 500 decide on what to talk about. We can't get, but then they didn't have to go across the aisle. So maybe it was a little easier than that. And the lottery they used also chose a board of 10 men that they called generals, and they were responsible for the protection of the city itself against any possible invaders. And historically, Athens had a fairly strong military to protect it. On at least 3 occasions, the Persians, which were known for their strength, attacked the city and tried to break it down. And each time they were driven back with it. And so they had real trouble. In 87 BC, a Roman general named Felix actually laid siege to the city and to the port that was near Athens. He could not breach the wall. They simply kept him outside. However, he was able to protect the city to the extent that they cut off all the supplies and everything going into it, which made it very difficult. 5 months after that siege began, some deserters snuck out of the city and they were captured. And they told Felix where the weak spots were in the wall itself. And so on midnight, you ready for this? March 1st, 86 BC.
Oh, that's what you were talking about.
Yeah. The armies of Felix broke through the wall and virtually destroyed the city. They burned a lot of it. They killed many, many of the inhabitants who were in it. And then about 35 years later, in 51 BC, Athens sent an ambassador to Rome and asked for some aid to rebuild at least parts of the city. And so in 47 BC, Julius Caesar liked the idea and began to send aid. The general feeling is he probably would have given a lot more, but you know, the old story of you two, Brutus, he got assassinated, and so he was unable to. However, Augustus assumed responsibility to carry that on, and it kept going. It was actually into the 2nd century after the birth of Christ that the city was largely rebuilt. It never really became the city it had been. And the feeling is that it was being rebuilt by these Roman emperors because directly or indirectly, they'd all been educated because of the teachers that came out of Athens. Several of them had been in Athens itself. Others were educated by those who had been educated in Athens. So they felt a real sense of loyalty to it. By the time of Paul's visit, it was no longer, he said, an important city. Corinth, which we'll visit in 2 or 3 weeks, was the commercial and political center of Greece under the Roman Caesars. But Athens was still the educational center. Athens had in its history the great philosophers, Pericles, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and so forth. And they really looked at, they were the ones who shaped the thinking. And if you study philosophy today, and my wife does not recommend that at all, if you study philosophy today, you'll find that most of our philosophies flow out of the philosophies of one or more of them. The word philosopher literally means love of wisdom. And the primary goal of the philosophers was to decipher what was the underlying meaning of life, the universe, where it came from, and so forth. What was the purpose of it? A little later today, we'll look at a couple of those philosophies, the Epicureans and the Stoics. But they wanted to explain what the meaning of life was and how our physical world relates to the spiritual world and so forth on it. Dan?
If you look at a map of I don't have it yet. If you look at a map of the city of Athens, it's basically broken down into two major areas in Athens. You have the Agora, and then you have the Acropolis. And I want to look a little bit at each of those just for fun and give us a background of kind of what's going on. The Agora, the name Agora literally means open place of assembly. And it was designated a designated area in a city where freeborn citizens could come and gather and hear civic announcements. They could discuss politics, they could discuss religion and philosophy. And it eventually became kind of an open air marketplace, and you could just go and hang out. I'm sure there were little, shops along the way that you could, buy a cup of coffee and sit and chat or things like that. The Agora in Athens was famous. So many of the places, so many of the people that were important in, particularly as Dad said, philosophy, uh, taught in the Agora. They would come and sit there and gather their disciples around. In Jerusalem, it was the temple where the rabbis would gather and chat, and in Athens, it was the Agora. The Agora is kind of an open air area. There's a major road that runs right through the center of it, and all kinds of different places to sit all around. Um, the Agora here in this photo, of course, it has been destroyed, centuries before. Is this flat area down here on the lower right hand corner? All of that is part of the Agora. The Agora in Athens is located beneath the northern slope of the Acropolis. And like I said, you could sit there and talk to famous philosophers and discuss religion. It was viewed as a sacred place. It had many buildings and statues laid out on that major road, the Pantheistic Way, which ran right through the middle of Athens. Had a bunch of government buildings in it. The law courts were in it. Even a prison was in there. The marketplace in the Agora was divided up into various specialities. So they had a section where you could go and get food for certain kinds of food. You could go and there was a certain area where all the bankers would sit, and you could go and get a loan if you needed to, or talk to someone about finances or things like that. There were certain sections where certain schools of philosophy would be, and so if you wanted to talk to a particular philosopher, they kind of had their office hours, office space there out in the open where you could go and be a part of that. Some pretty cool buildings. You had the Heptasis Temple, gorgeous building. In our map here, the Heptasis. Oops! Now we're in trouble. The Athens temple is up here at the top corner, overlooking the Agora. In fact, that's it in the top left hand corner there. Just a gorgeous place, a building to really be part of. You had various stoas. Stoas are colonnades, places where the philosophers would sit. Each philosopher would have an area, put up some chairs to have their discussions and things. This stoa of Atlas is on the left-hand side. It's over. I don't know if you can see it over here on this the right-hand side of the Atlas. The Odeon here in the center is where they would recite poetry and produce plays and all kinds of things like that. The arts were involved there. Temples everywhere. Everywhere there was a temple. There's a statue to Zeus and Apollo and all kinds of temples and buildings that were there as part of that. Uh-oh, I just lost you guys. Hey, welcome back. The Acropolis was divided into, like I said, these specialty areas, and lots of temples. Apollo was the city's patron god. Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, Neptune, Diana, all had temples there around the agora. And the statues were made of stone and brass and ivory and gold and silver and marble, and just it must have been a fantastic place to go and sit and relax and view and think. um, and of course, the keynote of the agora is um, the statue to Athena, the goddess where Athens gets its name from. On top of the agora, you also have, or next to the agora, you also have the second major part of the city of Athens, which is the Acropolis. Share the Acropolis. The Acropolis was an ancient citadel. You can see it right there in the center of the map. The agora is up in the just north, the north left side of the map. But the Acropolis was a huge citadel fortress area right in the center, right on top of the mountain that Athens surrounded. The Parthenon that is so very famous was in the Acropolis, along with some other temples and things like that. Here's a great picture of the Acropolis. You can see it sitting up there on top of that mountain, just dominating the surrounding countryside, the surrounding city. Just fantastic. One of these days, I'm going to get to Greece and get to see some of these things when I become rich and famous.
Who wants to be famous anymore?
Yeah, okay, that's true.
Rich is fine.
The word Acropolis actually comes from the Greek word, which means highest point, which makes sense. It's on top of the mountain. On a flattish topped rock high above the city itself. And like I said, it just dominates the area. In the Acropolis itself is the Parthenon, and that is an enormous temple that kind of even today is the heart of the Acropolis. And this is the main temple then to Athena. It was built about 500, 400 or so BC, 600 or so BC. The idol to Athena was made of gold and ivory and was so large it was said to be that its gleaming spear point was visible 40 miles away. And it was known as one of the most beautiful and famous buildings in the world. And I think it still is one of the most beautiful buildings in the world, as torn down and as ruined as it is still just a beautiful, beautiful building. The goddess Athena, there's the tip of the spear. The goddess Athena in Greek mythology was the daughter of Zeus. And she was considered to be a goddess of both war and peace. So kind of everything that's involved with that. She was known to the Athenians for her skill in warfare, was often seen in companions when they drew pictures of her. It was in the companionship of some of the great heroes. And so that's kind of who Athena was. According to, like I said, Greek mythology, she was the daughter of Metis and Zeus. Supposedly, this is This is not theology. This is mythology. Supposedly, Metis gave birth to Athena, but Metis had been swallowed by Zeus, and so Athena began growing in Zeus's head, and then Hephaestus, the other building we saw, um, attacked Zeus and cut Zeus open, and then Athena came out, not as an infant, but as a fully grown warrior, dressed in armor, ready for battle. That's the mythology behind it. I think it's pretty cool. One of the names given to Athena was Gray Eyes. And you're thinking, what? Well, she was named Gray Eyes as a term of endearment because there was a tradition that she was the one who had given olive trees to the Greeks. And if you've ever seen an olive tree, the underside of the leaf of I wish I had a picture of that. I should have had a picture of that. But the underside of the leaf of an olive tree is gray. And when the wind blows, those leaves flare up. And so you can see the gray eyes of the trees. And they said that was Athena's many eyes. Like most of the gods or goddesses of ancient mythology, Athena was able to change her form. In the Odyssey, that very famous story, epic, she's depicted as changing herself into a bird and also taking on a form of a person by the name of Mentor, who became a friend of Odysseus in his Odyssey. And like I said, existing statues of her depict her as a young woman wearing a helmet, holding a shield, spear. Some of them also depict a small owl next to her because she was seen as someone who was very wise, watchfulness. In addition to the Temple of Athena, Athens was home to a myriad of additional smaller temples and altars. An ancient writer named Xenophon, Xenophon, what a great name, described Athens as, quote, one great altar, one great sacrifice. There were more gods in Athens than in all the rest of the country. Later on, a Roman satirist hardly exaggerated when he wrote that, quote, it was easier to find a god in Athens than a man. The Athenians welcomed all kinds of gods. It didn't matter who you believed in. If you believed in a god, come to Athens, build a temple to them and worship them. That seemed to be fine with them.
And in case we missed one, the god to the unknown, an altar to the unknown god.
Which we will get to next week.
Yep, that's next week's study. Paul arrived in Athens. Athens 1716 describes his initial experience when he got there. Artie?
Well, while Paul was waiting for them in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols.
Others were probably impressed, as we would be if we were visiting the city today, with the architecture and all of the things that were a part of it. Paul was not impressed with that at all. But what stuck in his mind was the idol worship that was a part of the city. And it's because of that idol worship that he preaches the sermon he does preach that we'll get to next week. And one of the reasons why this background is so important to it. Luke wrote that Paul wasn't simply upset by it, but he was greatly disturbed. A rather interesting word. Originally, it had medical overtones for the Greeks. It referred to somebody who had epilepsy or had a seizure. And we can imagine the reactions, the feelings that we would have if we were walking through the marketplace, the agora, and suddenly somebody had an epileptic fit or a seizure and so forth. In time, the word moved on from simply the medical one to one who was angry or irritated. Its other use in the New Testament is a rather interesting one. Paul uses the same word in 1 Corinthians 13:5, where he says, talking about love, and says, love is not easily angered. So, he's using that tense. The way in which he wrote it here, the verb in imperfect tense, denotes that he didn't suddenly become angry, but the more he saw, the angrier he became. The more idolatry that was a part of the city, the more upset he was. The word distressed is used, I said only one other time in the New Testament, but is used several times in the Old Testament in the Greek translation, the Septuagint of the Old Testament. And it's used to describe those occasions when God was especially upset with the Israelites, when they did things that were, by God's opinion, just a little more over the hill than usual. One time that he uses that word is in terms of the image of the golden calf that Moses or Aaron formed while Moses was on Mount Sinai. And it's described this way in Exodus 32. That whole thing is described there, but Deuteronomy 9:7 describes God's reaction to that.
Remember this and never forget how you aroused the anger of the Lord your God in the wilderness. From the day you left Egypt until you arrived here, you have been rebellious against the Lord.
The Greek translation of you arouse the anger of the Lord your God is the same terminology that Luke used here to describe Paul's reaction to the idolatry and the sinfulness of the city. My feeling, if I were a pastor and not just a retired teacher, this is the way we should be reacting to the sinfulness that we see all around us. It should upset us. I fear one of the things we've done as Christians is become so used to it that it just kind of, oh, there it goes, so forth with it. And Paul says the city was full, or Luke says the city was full of idols. That word occurs only here in the New Testament, and as far as we know, in no other Greek literature. So the assumption is that Paul coined a word. When it's the only use of it, it's a little hard to translate it, but probably the NIV has done as well as any when saying the city is full of idols. Others have suggested that he could have written the city was swamped by or smothered by them. And again, perhaps that's a description of the sinfulness in America, in Canada today. Hopefully, prayerfully, the revival that we're hearing about in several of our universities and colleges is going to take root. We need it desperately. And there is no doubt that Paul was troubled by the abundance he saw. In verse 22, he said, these people are very religious, but that was the wrong kind of religion. Keep in mind Paul's background. I think it helps us to picture what's going on in his mind as he sees all of this. Paul grew up committed to the fact that there was only one God. Exodus 20, verses 3 and 4 was the foundation of Paul's early years.
You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth beneath, or in the waters below.
That was Paul's foundational teaching. And now he's walking through this city and he's looking at these people, and it had to have been extremely upsetting to him. Angered by the idolatry in Athens, Luke records Paul's response in verses 17 and the first part of 18.
Acts 17, 17, and 18. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with him.
Luke records that Paul, when he observed this, knew he had to do something. And so he introduces it so or therefore. He had to confront the idolatry. I think today, too often, Christians decide that the answer to the sinfulness of our world is to kind of retreat from it, join together in the safeness of a church and commiserate together with fellow believers on how terrible the world is. And there certainly is a place for us coming together, encouraging one another, and so forth. But Paul knew that that world out there had to be confronted in one way or another, and he chose to do it. And Luke records that he reasoned with them. That word reasoned carried actually a couple of different meanings to it, and it could mean simply argued with them or carried on a discourse with them, with it. Paul interacted with them because of their worshiping of the gods. The King James translation of this says Paul disputed with them. And again, probably using a rather old English word. That carries today the connotation of somehow or other a tone of anger. I don't think Paul was expressed that anger in his tone, but he simply said, we need to talk about this. And he began. And Luke tells us he carried on his ministry in 3 different locations. Paul reasoned in the synagogue. That, of course, was always his starting point. I went to the synagogue, shared with the Jews, usually got driven out before too many Sabbaths were over. But that's where he began. And in the synagogue in Athens, as in most of the synagogues in the Roman Empire, there were Jews and there were seeking Greeks. Today, I think if we were going to relate to that, we'd say it's a church ministry. And we need to remember that in all of our churches, on any given Sunday, there's likely to be those present who perhaps have come for years, but have never made a commitment to the Lord. And it's part of our pastoral ministry to present the gospel to them. And secondly, Paul ministered in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. Today, I suppose we would call that street evangelism, visitation evangelism, going out into the areas where people are and approaching them that way. It's what we need to do as we confront friends, fellow workers, family, whatever, with the truth of the gospel. And then thirdly, Luke says, Paul debated with a group of Epicureans and Stoic philosophers. These 2 groups, radically different in their philosophies, but neither one of them believed in a resurrection. And none of them really believed that we were held accountable in any way for our actions. For them, death was kind of the end of it all. And so Paul is going to debate with them. If there's a counterpart of that today, I would say it's those people who are working in our universities, our Campus Crusade ministry people, and those that are dealing with the quote unquote intellectuals of our day to share Jesus with them. I think what I find interesting here is that Paul presents the gospel in a variety of different ways, because the philosophers will approach it differently than the Jews in the synagogue and so forth. And we need to be aware that people are different. and the presentation has to be different. Peter expresses this in 1 Peter 3:15.
Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have, but do this with gentleness and respect.
I don't think he argued with him. I think it was gently, probably firmly, but with respect. Paul's ministry in Athens is an example of just that. Dan?
One of the things that I would say just amazes me at how coincidental it is, realizing it's not coincidental at all, it's God working through everything, is the fact that Paul is the one that gets to Athens and starts to discuss some very deep things with these philosophers, the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Because if you think about the very early Christians, I don't see anyone except for Paul being up to the task. You know, Peter, he had a life as a fisherman. that's that's not going to get him in the door to talk to some of these Epicurean and Stoic philosophers. Paul was by far, from what we know, by far the most highly educated person in early Christianity. You know, he had studied under Gamaliel, who was, I mean, that's the Harvard and the Yale of the of the Jewish world. He knew the philosophies. He knew how to I say argue with them, how to have uh, these kinds of conversations with the very learned people, because he was a very learned person. And I'm just amazed at how God arranged all of this. That you know, Paul wanted to stay in Asia Minor, and then he gets this message, the Macedonian call, come to Macedonia and visit us. And he gets over there and gets kicked out of a number of cities until God is finally directing him down to Athens, where he can sit there and talk with some of the greatest minds in the world. And Paul is right at home talking with them. And
Tarsus.
he's also perfectly at home talking with Lydia by the river, and perfectly at home talking in the synagogue with the Jewish people. That's who he was. And I just find that amazing. Dad, did you have something to input?
I was just going to say, God intentionally, wisely knowing what he knows,
Yeah.
had Paul raised in Tarsus. Wasn't quite the Athens of his day, but boy, it was close in terms of universities. And he interacted with all of that. And I'm sure he thought, oh, this is boring. And then God said, no, it's not, because I'm going to use you.
I'm gonna just wait a couple of years, Paul. When you get to Athens, all the stuff you're learning, you're gonna be putting into practice. A brief word on the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers as we get it going. Since they're mentioned specifically in here, I thought it might be a good idea to give you just a little bit of background on them. Epicurean philosophers. Epicureans were following a gentleman by the name of Epicurus, which kind of makes sense. Epicurus lived in the late 3rd or early 2nd century before Jesus. His philosophy centered on happiness. You need to have as much happiness now than, because this is all there is. And the term, the Epicurean term, actually became the name for eventually for what we call today, you know, almost pure hedonism. I am the most important thing, and if I'm happy, then life is good. Although Epicurus himself kind of balanced out tried to seek a balance between joy and pain, because of the way things go. The focus, since his time, has been more on the joy than the pain. Epicurus considered the gods that the rest of the Greek people were believing in, where they were so far removed from humans that at that point they took no interest in them. Because gods had no interest in mankind, there was no eternal reward or eternal punishment for actions that were done down here on earth. The gods really just didn't care anymore. They had no contact with us. And that's the way it was. At the heart of Epicureanism was the belief that this life is all there is. So enjoy it to the fullest. I've got a quote from Epicurus that I thought is very interesting. Death does not concern us, because as long as we exist, death is not here. And once it does come, we no longer exist. We live for the moment. We live for now because, well, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. And after that, there's nothing. So you might as well enjoy life. As long as it feels good, go for it. It actually sounds very, very much like much of modern Western society, doesn't it? I think this essence of Epicurean philosophy is very central to many of the philosophies of our day. Our age is dominated by pleasure first. Do what makes you feel happy. Enjoy yourself, because when it's all over, it's all over. Paul, raised in a very strictly Jewish environment in which there were godly standards that were to guide a life, was probably appalled by this philosophy. And of course, Paul preached a life after death, which Epicurus denies. And that doesn't really fit in very well with the Epicurean philosophy. And Paul has the opportunity to dialogue with them.
And
Um,
before you take that picture down,
yeah.
I'm impressed by the fact that he has gray eyes.
Well, the statue is kind of gray, so
Oh, okay.
that's
I thought he was mocking Athena.
No, I'm real impressed with his beard. I wish I had a beard like
Yeah.
that. Maybe I should grow mine out or something. At the opposite end of the philosophical scale were the Stoics. Um, he's got a pretty awesome beard too. I'm just saying, these Greeks know how to grow beards. Stoics were followers of a man named Zeno of Citium. Citium is in Cyprus, and his view in life basically dealt with primarily evil, and the responsibility of man was basically to grin and bear it. Life was controlled by fate, and so whatever happened in life, that's just what happened. Regardless of what comes my way, our response is simply just to take it. That's the way life is, and that's the way it goes. I've got a quote from him as well. Fate is the endless chain of causation whereby things are, the reason or formula by which the world goes on. We don't have any control over anything we do. It's just simply fate. The name Stoic itself comes from the belief that Xenos was there in the Agora in Greece, and had a particular spot or portico that he would sit at. And the Greek for portico, that we would call portico, is stoa. And so if you remember back a couple of slides ago when I was talking about the various stoas that are there, he had one in particular that he would sit in, and that's why they're called Stoics, because they could always go to the stoa and find him there. Stoics did actually believe in many gods, but not in a supreme god. And the gods really also very much actually kind of like Epicurean, had very little to do with mankind. We're kind of on our own, and we just live life. Whatever comes our way, we live it. That's the way it is. If we think about Stoics today, they don't necessarily call themselves Stoics, but the idea is that bad things happen and we just live our lives the way we can. God doesn't control my fate. I don't really control my fate. It just sometimes good things happen and sometimes bad things happen, and we plug our way on through in life. Seems to me to be a very depressing kind of philosophy um, to believe in. Uh, Paul reasoned with them. Paul was not just horrified at all of the gods that he saw, but and he wasn't content just to say, "Oh, that's bad. Okay, I'm moving on." Paul wanted people to understand who Jesus was. Paul's goal was to persuade them to turn from their worship of idols and their understanding of these false philosophies, and turn to discover who God is, the true God. Acts chapter 17, verse 18, the second half. Mom read the first half earlier, I believe. The second half tells us the results of Paul's talking with these Epicureans and Stoics. Mom, if you could read the second half of that.
Some of them, these Epicureans and Stoics, asked, "What is this babbler trying to say?" Others remarked, "He seems to be advocating foreign gods." They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection.
Very, very interesting discussion here, or comments from the Epicureans and the Stoics. First, they kind of insult Paul just a little bit, by saying, what is this babbler trying to say? Now, when we think of babbler, we think of someone who's just talking and making nonsense and things like that. And that term to babble is actually a very interesting one. It initially referred to birds that were just running around making noise, and as they were scrounging for food and stuff. And eventually, this term babblers came to talk about um, uh, vagrants or beggars who lived off the scraps of food they picked up in the gutter. That's what a babbler was. And basically, the idea was that someone who was a babbler didn't have any new notions themselves. They were plagiarizing everything. They didn't have an original thought in their head. They would just kind of plagiarize the ideas of others, and I can understand. I mean, these Epicureans and Stoics are in Greece, in the Agora in Athens. They are the top of the top, and here comes Paul. Yes, he is probably the most educated Christian at the time, but he still wasn't. He's still from the backwoods, if you understand what I'm trying to say from their perspective. Tarsus, yes, it was a university city, but it wasn't the top university. And so some of the Stoics and some of the Epicureans are saying, yeah, I mean, Paul, he's here, but he's not giving us too much that's new or that we can kind of hang on to or anything like that. And then secondly, that after he says, what is this babbler talking to us? They also say, they actually say, hey, this guy is teaching about foreign gods. Now, again, to the Greeks, you could believe in any god you wanted to. The Epicureans and the Stoics had decided there was no gods, or they weren't interested, and they didn't have any place for us. And when Paul starts to preach and says, yes, there is a God, and yes, he does care about you. In fact, he loves you so much that he sent his son Jesus to die on the cross and resurrect again, that they couldn't wrap their minds around that, because all of their teachings, all of their understanding was that gods are over there and we're over here, and never the twain shall meet. um when they talk about these foreign gods, it's very interesting. The phrase that is used, the Greek word is used, is daemon, I can't say it, daemonian. Basically, it could mean demons, foreign spiritual beings. It was sometimes used of lesser gods, so it didn't necessarily mean demon the way we think it meant, but not, he's not talking about Zeus or Athena or any of the big gods. He's talking about a lesser god, these foreign lesser gods. And then, and in fact, I think the Revised Standard Version, RSV version of the Bible, instead of saying foreign gods, it talks about foreign divinities, to kind of differentiate a lesser being than the gods necessarily. Jesus and the resurrection. That's what Paul is preaching. And it seems odd that Paul's critics would pick out his teachings on the resurrection, because they particularly the Epicureans and the Stoics did not believe in a resurrection. Life, when you die, life ends. Existence ends. After death, there is nothing. Um, there is actually in Greek mythology an interesting story about these two gods that are a husband and wife, and they kind of interact in different ways. And there's some suggestion that maybe these Epicureans and Stoics are trying to tie in God the Father and Jesus into this. Oh, he's teaching about these other gods. Um, because there's a resurrection involved in that. The wife dies and the husband resurrects the wife. And so there could be, when they say they're talking about these lesser deities, that some of them might have been thinking, hey, he's talking about these other gods. And Paul wants to make it very clear that no, I'm not talking about those other gods. I'm going to talk about the true God. And Luke begins in verse 19 of Acts chapter 17. They Paul is at a place where he was free to share what he's teaching. And then in verse 22, Acts 17:22, Luke begins to record what Paul said and taught at this occasion. And I am so excited for next week when we get to talk about it, because at this point we have about 7 minutes left, and there's no way we can get through Paul's message in the Agora for in 7 minutes. So we'll spend next week talking about that.